Thanks, Hayley, and thanks to James for helping out in the compilation of the presentation. And thanks to Greg as well for being the host today. So as Hayley said, we're going to focus on a couple of the key agronomic decisions first in how to deal with recovery from the dry. And I guess you can really break it down into three sort of key ways in which restoring cash flow, which is the obvious thing that's the forefront of everyone's mind in recovery. It seems obvious, but how do we do that? And the first is working out how to best manage your fallow. Secondly, working out when to plant. And then thirdly, it's about maximising crop yield to make agronomic decisions. And so the reason that's a very logical flow is that in the middle of the dry period, we're already in that first stage of fallow management because it's been so dry for so long. The first stage is what we're probably doing anyhow. But again, there are things we need to remember in order to capture as much rainfall as you can. We'll then work out when we have got enough rainfall stored in the soil, how do we maximise the chance of crop success? And then finally, what are the decisions we make in crop in order to effectively convert that stored moisture into grain at the end of the day? So the first point there under fallow management is to remember where it all starts, and that's about the intensity and duration of rainfall. That has a major impact on erosion potential, and given that stubble cover is often one of our major challenges, this is something you really need to keep in mind. Some people say that every drought is broken with a flood, and that is often true, that heavy rainfall on a bare fallow is a major risk, and yet it is quite common, particularly in the central and northern parts of our state. So I guess the main point there is that to remember that while it is dry, that is a ideal time to be ensuring that contour banks and waterways are operating or able to operate effectively, and that they are well maintained. And so the key points in those areas, waterways in particular, often get forgotten about. The woody weeds that often turn up in those places, they need to be managed as appropriate. And also the entry points for contour banks into those waterways need to be at an adequate angle and not too steep and not too shallow. So they need to effectively convey water from the paddock to the waterway safely. The two things that happen in those big events that cause issues with contour banks and waterways are essentially low bank height. So always make sure your bank heights are adequate and avoid channel blockages within the contour bank channel itself, particularly as you change gradients. So there's been plenty of evidence of those sort of problems in the past. This is a recent photo showing some of the issues you can have in a waterway. In the background in those two photos, the green grass you can see is the waterway, and there's some significant woody weed incursion in that waterway, as well as some other design problems which have meant that heavy rainfall has broken out of the waterway and caused erosion down the side of the waterway within the cultivated area. So these things do happen at times. No one's immune from them, but it's about trying to make sure that you're up to speed with your maintenance to avoid these sort of issues from happening. The channel depth, and I had to go back into the archives, this one's back into the early 80s, of what they used to call a Foot's measure of sediment transport, so field observation of transported sediment. It's basically how deep you sink into the contour channel when you walk through it. So that's a photo of David Freeburn, for those of you that might know, one of the eminent runoff scientists from the last 30 years in a paddock at Greenmount near Toowoomba. So you can see that those channels do fill up quite quickly, and if it's left in that state, then there will be significant problems further down in the design. Okay, so the next thing to think about in terms of rainfall is the type of rain that you receive is also important. So I've broken them there into the three categories that are typically talked about. So less than 12 millimetres of rainfall, or half an inch in the old scale, you'd say there's going to be significant evaporation loss if you don't get a reasonable follow-up rainfall. 12 to 50 millimetres can add to stored soil moisture, but particularly if there's no follow-up again for some time, you can get losses from events that are at the lower end of that scale. And then, of course, you've got more than 50 millimetres, which definitely can improve stored moisture, particularly on a cracking clay soil, but there are serious erosion risks with those types of events. And most people go, oh, yeah, I understand where we get a lot of smaller falls, but why does that really matter? Well, that's because only 20 to 30% of the rain that falls from the sky ends up as stored soil moisture in a dry land environment in the northern cropping region. So it's really important that if we do everything we can to remain at the upper end of that band and try to store as much moisture as we can and as quickly as we can. Evaporation is a major source of losses there, particularly if your soil is very dry and when rainfall you do receive is low and infrequent, and that is typical of a lot of drought years. Okay, so as I just said, you really do need to focus on capturing what rain does fall. And if you take one point away from today, you need to remember that stubble is king in a dryland farming system. You need to do whatever you can to increase stubble cover, because without stubble cover, it's very, very difficult to accumulate soil moisture. And without accumulated soil moisture, it's very difficult to establish a successful crop and come out of that dry period. So the biggest problem we have is once we start to store some moisture after the first few rainfall events, though, is that weeds obviously come back quite quickly. If they are not well managed, they can significantly deplete the stored moisture that you're trying to accumulate. So you have to be on top of your weed management early. You have to try to maintain the cracking surface in clay soils. Cracks are a significant way of building soil moisture, and obviously at the end of a dry period, those cracks are often quite significant. However, sometimes tillage is required, and the problem we have with that is that tillage can increase compaction, which reduces the rate that soil moisture, rainfall can move into the ground and be stored as soil moisture. And so you need to try to not over cultivate to maintain the surface cracks to maximise infiltration. Everyone will say, well, that's fine, Rod, but what do I do when the last crop was a near failure and I've got hardly any cover left? It's great to say we need more stubble, but you can't do that without growing something. Surface roughness, so this is when surface tillage of, I'm talking about 50 millimetres deep or thereabouts, it can help in the absence of stubble, particularly in those soils that do not crack open. So there's certainly some red-brown earths and some alluvial loams that are farmed throughout Queensland that are good examples of non-cracking soils. Cultivation is necessary at times when you do not have any cover. In fact, there's been significant work done which shows that if you don't till those soils, it can take a lot longer to come out of that stage. Now, James will talk further about this later on, but one of the more recent research advances in this space has been about the use of cover cropping to build stubble cover, and James will go into that in a lot more detail about how and when you might consider growing a crop simply to produce stubble and not grain in order to store more moisture to then successfully establish a grain crop. You need to remember too, in the first crop that you're going to plant, you need to think about stubble persistence. So our cereal crops, for example, produce stubbles that tend to last a lot longer in the system, whereas legumes and oilseeds, generally speaking, produce less. And so coming out of a low cover situation, legumes and oilseeds are not ideal because the stubble they produce is lower in volume and breaks down quicker, and you can rapidly end up back in that same scenario of having low ground cover. A cereal is preferred if all the other factors line up. So this is a photo taken from a long-term tillage trial that was run at Biloela by Bruce Radford and Greg Thomas, and others have written this up extensively. That photo, I think, tells the story really well, that after 125 millimetre storm in 1991, you can see the plot on the left-hand side of the screen. stored significantly more moisture than the plot on the right, which had been cultivated and compacted. And I'm sure those of you that have been in paddocks where they've been cultivated and a stubble paddock on the other side would have seen similar runoff events after heavy storms. So that's just a bit of a summary that your low cover means that it slows down the rate of soil moisture storage, but it can also increase runoff and erosion, which causes more issues. This image really sort of summarizes what's happening at the soil level when that does happen. And so you'll see in the image on the left there, when the raindrops, particularly in heavy rain, hit the soil surface, the energy within those raindrops actually smashes up the top of the soil at a very much enlarged level. You don't try and get down on your hands and knees in the middle of a storm to see it. It's very, very difficult. So what happens is when those large droplets smash into the soil surface, they disrupt all the fine particles on the top, and that's how you can get significant crusting in non-cracking soils after heavy rain. It's the energy in the raindrops causing that damage. Whereas on the right-hand side, you'll see that having a living plant cover is preferred, but stubble is the next best thing. The stubble actually absorbs the energy in the raindrops and allows infiltration to occur over a longer period of time, which therefore means you store more moisture in the soil. How much cover do I need? And this is always a source of much consternation. Trying to assess cover is something that's learned a little bit. You need to spend some time looking at it, but it's no different to the grazing scenario where if you don't have ground cover, you can't get moisture and pasture growth. In a grain cropping system, the research has consistently shown that if you drop below that 30%, which is the upper right-hand image, then the rate of infiltration and therefore moisture storage is reduced dramatically. And certainly by the time you get to 10%, the top left-hand image, there's a significant risk of runoff and erosion due to a lack of infiltration. Just stop and think though that, about how often you would see that in a typical wheat fallow at the start of the fallow and the end of the fallow. So the 70% image down the bottom would be quite common at harvest to have that level of ground cover. However, tillage in particular can break down that level of stubble quite rapidly. In fact, one pass with an offset disc, for example, could get you back below 30% in one pass. So you do really need to think about the potential impacts versus benefits when making those decisions. The soils do differ though in infiltration, and this is some work done in southern Queensland. And you'll see on the left-hand side, we're looking at a brigalow Balar clay, and on the right-hand side is a red-brown earth. The difference you see there is mainly from the cracking versus non-cracking characteristic of those two soils. So you can see there that certainly zero till with high cover and cracked surface is preferable in terms of infiltration. And in the red-brown earth, some level of cultivation can actually help improve infiltration on those soils. What about weeds? I mentioned them briefly before, and this is a rule of thumb that goes back some years, but it's still a good one to keep in mind. But certainly over summer, if it takes about 7 to 8 days for a weed to establish, and they can then grow at 2 to 3 centimetres a day. So remember I said earlier that once you need to have moisture stored deeper in the profile so you don't have evaporation losses. Well, we would say below 10 centimetres. Once those weeds get into that, that's the non-evaporated area. Rough maths tells us that after 12 days, those weeds are already using up stored soil moisture that you could have being used for a crop further down the track. And so while weeds obviously can get into the moisture quite quickly, 5 millimetres a day, you might think, oh, that's not really that much in the bigger scheme of things, but start multiplying that out over 2 to 3 weeks. And when you're thinking about a 120 to 150 millimetre stored soil moisture profile when it's full, you can eat through a lot of moisture very quickly. So the summary there is that you need to make sure those weeds are controlled while they're small, and to make sure that they don't use the water, and also to stop them setting seed and creating a bigger problem further down the track. Okay, so this is the next step after the fallow management stage is about, we've got to the end of the fallow, we've controlled our weeds, and we think, you know, there's a bit of moisture there now, we've had a few rainfall events, surely we've got to be right to go and take a punt, put something in. I'll say it again, that stored moisture is the key to a successful crop in this environment. So the temptation there is that that first heavy rainfall event on a dry profile, you think, wow, we just had 75 mils over 2 days, that's brilliant. We'll go and get the planter ready and hop into it. Remember what I said earlier about how the rain falls and what moisture is already stored. You may not actually have enough to plant a successful crop on that first event. So the way you make sure that that decision is happening at the right time is by effectively assessing soil moisture at, regularly after those events. The temptation is to go, oh, it'll be right, it's too dry, I won't worry about it, but you need to be able to consistently keep an eye on what's happening with stored moisture in order to make a decision at the right time. A lot of people say, well, you know, how do we go about doing that? There are several ways you can do it. James will talk about some of the tools through the Climate app a bit later on that give you a way of following soil moisture. But a push probe is a simple and fairly well accepted way of testing those soil moisture levels. And a lot of people say, oh, I've got a big 12-inch screwdriver, that'll do it. Well, that's not telling you what's happening far enough down in the soil. And certainly kicking away at the surface with your boot will give you an idea about the surface, but not what's happening at 60 to 90 centimetres in the profile. So I just, you need to make sure that the push probe you're using, you've had experience in that soil type. Make sure that you're sort of keeping an eye on how much is there and thinking about, well, what rain have I had versus how much moisture have I stored will give you an indication of how well you've managed that fallow period. So I'll hand over to James now, and he'll talk a little bit more about some of the cover cropping research.
Thanks for that, Rob. Yes, look, I'm going to briefly touch on some results coming out of 2 DAF and GRDC projects. One being the fallow efficiency results from the recent farming systems project, which sort of supports some of the stuff, Rod, you just seen Rod present. It just gives us a bit of an idea of what sort of fallow efficiencies we can expect across the northern region following some different crop types. Give us a bit of a baseline as to what goes on there. And the second bit of work I'm going to present is some stuff on a recent project on cover cropping. The results are largely going to be based from stuff that was done down in between Gundawindi and Toowoomba. And I'll get into why that is in a second. And really, I'm going to focus more on a summer cover crop than a winter, given the usage pattern we'd expect. So just as a quick, I guess, addition to what Rod's put in, and the discussion about, you know, small amounts of rainfall, and if you get follow-up over time, you're more likely to be able to store that moisture. The image you can see on your screen there is one of our cover crop sites, and you can see there's a bare treatment in the background of that site, and this is a couple of days after some rainfall, and you can see pretty clearly that that bare treatment has well and truly dried out, whereas in the foreground, where we've still got probably 50% stubble cover, there's still moisture retained at surface, and that will come quite important in some later results I'm going to show. I just thought it just a nice little link to what Rod's gone into. But I will start first of all with some farming systems results. So as an idea of the sort of fallow efficiencies we typically see across the northern region, what we're seeing here is a box and whisker plot. And so what that means is that 0.26 on above winter cereals, that line there, that's about the average of what sort of fallow efficiency we see. So following a winter cereal crop, 26% of the rainfall that falls in that fallow gets stored. You can see winter pulses, which is just fava beans and chickpeas in this data set. So we saw about 13% following a winter pulse. There's some canola there that's probably not relevant to anyone in Queensland. Mung bean, which I'll get to in a second, And you can see sorghum's also at 0.26. There's two reasons for that. This is solid plant sorghum. If it was skip row or double sip, we'd expect it to be closer to our winter pulse numbers. The reason that sorghum can provide such high fallow efficiency though is simply that winter versus summer fallow. So it might provide less ground cover of sorghum stubble than a winter cereal crop, but it's going into a period of lower evaporative demand. So it still provides pretty good fallow efficiency when solid plant, that is. The mung bean one there, as you can no doubt tell, is a bit crazy, saying that almost 50% of the rainfall that falls after a mung bean crop will be captured as soil water. The entire reason for that is all the mung bean crops in this project have been planted into existing cereal stubble, and they've all been short fallowed afterwards. So essentially what we're seeing there is the equivalent of a very short winter cereal fallow. So we remove the summer period from the cereal crop, and we have good stubble cover from our cereals coming out the other end, and we get just a winter period with a winter cereal stubble following the mung bean crop with some rainfall patterns that we've seen there. You can see that the numbers below each of those winter cereals, winter pulses, below each of the categories, so the 81 beneath winter cereals, that's how many crops we've measured the fallow efficiency following. So there's been 81 winter cereals, and we've measured the fallow efficiency of 81 fallows after a winter cereal. So we'd be pretty confident with that number and with the 44 winter pulses, with the 20 sorghums. Obviously, with the ones where there's less measurements taken, there's more variability in there. The far end one, and this is one that's probably equally as important, is that cotton maize system. And in these systems, we're essentially talking a bare fallow when it comes out the other end. And we're down at 0.5% and sometimes even negative amounts of water captured during the fallow. So there's water used in the fallow due to either evaporation or could just be some instrumentation error. But that's, I think, quite a thing worth taking note of, especially when we're thinking about bare fallows at the moment. For some local events, and as Hayley sort of mentioned at the start, originally this was planned to be a bit of a workshop series up near CQ. So it did pull out some stuff just from the emerald farming system site. And you can see here that it matches pretty closely with the overall northern region. So once again, our winter cereal, our wheat fallows are giving us about 25, 26% where that cross is on average, and ranging from that 20 to 35% sort of range. Interestingly, your chickpeas at the emerald site we're providing a bit better fallow efficiency than across the rest of the northern region. That must just be the excellent chickpea crops you guys grow up there. But it's still fairly close, ranging from about 15 to 25%. And once again, that sorghum's pretty similar on average, ranging to 20 to 25%. So there was only one mung bean crop, so I can't really give you a range of results from the mung beans that were planted at the emerald site. But that's just showing it matches up fairly well with what we've seen across the entire region. So that's really all the background I wanted to go over in terms of fallow efficiency. Just give us a bit of an idea of what we see in existing cropping systems and what we'd see after a typical crop anyway. And then, because the work that I'm going to talk about next is really about whether there's any improvements that could be made following these crops. So we just need to know where we're starting from. Now, the work I'm going to talk about here is based on 1 year of trial data from 2 sites established in southern Queensland between Gundy and Toowoomba. And whilst there were additional sites established and there were many treatments put in, wouldn't you know, we did this in 2017 and most of our sites had decided to never rain again afterwards. So I know we've still got one site there that basically after we terminated the cover crop, it didn't rain again until earlier this year. So there was no point measuring any change in soil water. It basically didn't have any. I think there is still some ideas of measuring that, but I'll just talk about the stuff we've actually got results for. So what I've got here is there's 2 sites. One is a winter cover crop and one was a summer cover crop. The one you see on your screen now is our summer cover crop, which was planted to millet in late October or mid to late October, and terminations were done from mid to early November, mid-November to early December. There were additional treatments, so there was some pulse treatments, some legume treatments, some mixed treatments. I'm only going to focus on our three millet termination treatments, as they were the most promising. Our legumes in general broke down too fast to be effective as working as a cover crop. So what you can see on your screen there is what obviously our bare, and I should have mentioned this. Our bare treatment was bare. So when we're talking bare, this site had deep P applied to it in August, and we were establishing a cover crop there in October. So we were well less than 5% ground cover in our bare treatment. What you can see in the other images there, so it sort of give an idea of what the bare looked like, what our mid-termination treatment looked like at termination, and then what sort of stubble that left approximately 5 to 6 months later at the end of March. So you can see our mid probably left us with that 30% ground cover by March. Our early termination, with not as much stem and more leaf biomass, was probably cutting it close, and our late termination was, probably over 80–90% coverage even at March. So what we want to know there is, well, really, so we've obviously you can grow a crop, terminate it, and improve stubble cover. Great. The logic behind it, you have to think, is how much water does it use to grow that cover crop, and what is the benefit out the other end? So what this slide is showing, and I hope it's easy enough to follow, is we're measuring changes in soil moisture from 0 to 90 centimetres under, well, actually 5 treatments here. We put a millet late treatment, which is rolled, which is that dotted line, a millet late treatment, which is that solid purple line, a millet mid termination, which was done sort of mid-November. I should have said the late termination was done early December, and then sort of early-ish November, the early termination was done, which is this millet early dotted line. And we can see the changes in soil moisture over time on this left axis, and our control is that black line. Running across the top of the screen, we've actually got a list of rainfall events, and we can sort of see what sort of rainfall we had. This is in 2017, when the crops were established, through to 2018, when we planted and harvested a wheat crop. And you can sort of make out pretty easily that, we had about 45 mils of rain leading up to and immediately following the planting of the cover crop. By the time of early spray out, we can see that we probably used 30 mils of water, whereas our control treatment, our bare treatment, had managed to accumulate probably 15 mils. So we're probably about 50 mils behind on our early termination treatment to start with. With our control, our bare treatment managed to accumulate 18, 15 mils, and our cover crop treatment using about 25, 30 mils of stored water. We get to our mid-termination treatment, and we've actually only used 20 mils of stored water, because we had this 40 mil rainfall event, which helped with the water usage. So it just replenished that top layer. But interestingly, our control had only managed to accumulate an extra, probably 5 mils at best from that additional 40 mils that fell. And lastly, you can see by our late treatment, which is about 6 to 8 weeks after planting, and we've used about 40 mils of water at termination in our late spray out treatment, and we've accumulated about 20. So starting about 60 mils behind our control in the late spray out treatment. It actually does get down to almost 80 mils behind by the time we get to one of our later measurements. And look, that could just be an issue in the measuring accuracy or not. But what I'd just like to draw your attention to is this section here. You can see we actually had quite a large rainfall event post the termination of the late cover crop. And you can see even our late terminated treatment, which started 50 to 60 mils behind, managed to jump up ahead of this control treatment based off this one event. So we got quite high cover crop or fallow efficiency based on that. And the other thing we can see with the mid and early terminated treatments, the slope of their lines post-termination is much steeper than that cover. So by the time we get through, and I might just jump through to a next one, you can see by the time we get through to when we're planting wheat, our late, mid and early treatments are all sitting, well, the late one's probably about 20 mils ahead, probably 15 mils ahead in our mid termination, and 5 to 10 ahead in our early termination. The millet roll treatment is exactly what it sounds like. So it's just terminated the same as the late, and then it had a rubber roller go over the top of it, just to see if that would make any difference. It did in this particular trial. It didn't in another one, so I wouldn't put too much faith in that just there. But you can see we managed to get roughly 20 to 40 mils in our best treatment of additional water stored compared to our control. The other interesting part of this is that all of our cover crop treatments managed to extract more water from the soil by the time the wheat crop was finished. So you see our control here, we've gone down 30 mils at the end, but we can see we've actually extracted an extra 30 or 40 mils more out in those mid and early termination treatments, and in probably 40 mils more in the late terminated treatments. So I guess that's just a bit of a look at what sort of fallow efficiencies we can get. So that was the Bungunya side I'm looking at there. So on your screen, that's the right-hand column. And this is the fallow efficiency we got for a summer cover crop. We got about 38% for the early spray out, which isn't great compared to, it's an improvement over what a normal stubble would be, but it's probably not worth writing home about. But our mid and late spray out both got 50 to 65% in fallow efficiency, which means 50% of the rain, or 48%, and then 64% of the rainfall was captured in a late spray out treatment, which is fairly high considering our typically expected fallow efficiencies. Our winter site, which was Yulaban, had slightly high, but a very similar pattern in terms of the amount of extra that was stored. Aside from the early spray, which actually performed quite well there, but it was with a short fallow to planting. So we actually expect that treatment to do quite well if we did have a very short fallow for planting. And this is one of those stories, I think, where that extraction of more water and looking at that, the retention of moisture in that stubble really pays out. What this slide is showing is showing the wheat crop that was established following our millet and lab and other cover crops. So you can see our establishment in the bare fallow on that top line there, and it's not amazing. It is certainly okay, but certainly not amazing. We got slightly better establishment where we had a lab cover crop, but where we'd had that millet, any of those millet cover crops, even the early cover, I believe we got much better establishment, and that sort of probably flows through to why we got more extraction. We ended up with more plants per hectare, and it definitely flowed through to yield as well. So it's starting to look as though that there's some potential benefits there. What we want to know there then is, right, okay, so we've spent our cash. We spent $50 a hectare putting in a millet crop, and then we spent $20 to spray it out. What do we need to actually recover that cost, and how likely is it it's going to be so? So because I'm a bit lazy, we're going to use some rough round numbers. So to recoup $70 a hectare, we need, at $300 a tonne, we need about 230 kilos of grain. To grow 230 kilos of grain at a water use efficiency of 12 kilos a mil, we need to store about 20 mils of additional water, which is pretty much sort of on the line of what we were seeing being stored. So what we can sort of calculate there is, if we know in those previous treatments that by the time we terminated a cover crop, we were, 80 to 100 or 60 to 100 mils behind the control treatment. And then we know we need to store 20 mils of additional water on top of that. We say, all right, well, we need to store 80 to 120 mils of additional water. How likely is it we can do that? And it's actually really straightforward for us to work out based on some historical numbers. So if we're comparing that to a bare cover crop, the rainfall required to store that additional 20 mils compared to a bare system, we're looking at, we'd probably need about 220 mils or up to 300 mils over that cover crop, over the fallow period, for the cover crop to come out ahead, if we're comparing it to a bare fallow. If you've used 80 mils of water, so if you use 60 mil, we need to store 20, it's less than 200. If we used 100 mil and we need to store 20, it's getting up, over 250. But if we compare that to our winter cereal, if we've got a reasonable winter cereal cover, we actually end up over 500 mils of rainfall we require over the fallow to break even with the used water of the cover crop. And then with our chickpea and our skip row sorghum in this case, we end up somewhere in that 300 to 350 or 400 range. So it's a bit of a range there in how much we need. So we can probably already in our heads rule out that if we've got a reasonable winter cereal stubble, it's unlikely that the cover crop's going to store enough water to make up for its use. I mean, that's not saying we should rule them out completely, but just a rough number. And so basically we know that we need that amount of rainfall, and I'll just put that in this graph. So if we've got a fallow efficiency of 50% under our cover crop, a mid-termination water deficit of 100 millimetres, we need 220 mils to break even versus a bare or following a cotton crop, or we've done tillage or something like that, or deep peas gone in. You've got probably over 420 following a winter cereal or a solid sorghum, and you'd need 270, maybe 300 following a pulse crop or solid sorghum, or sorry, a skip row sorghum. And unfortunately, it's actually really easy for us to calculate how likely it is this will happen. So there's a great app, and I'm sure many of you are already aware of it, called Climate App. And it's just at this website here, so climateapp.net.au. And we can just go to the How Often tool, which is on the left-hand side of that website, and plug in what we want to know. So let's say this year at Billow, and you've put in a chickpea crop this year to get some cash flow back in. You've managed to get one up, and it comes to October, in a few months' time, you've harvested your chickpea crop, you've got very little stubble remaining, and you get 40 to 50 mils of rainfall. You've got very little stored moisture, but you get 40 to 50 mils of rainfall, and you're thinking, all right, well, do I put a cover crop in? How likely is it that I'll get back to it? So using this tool, we can just say, okay, so between the 15th of November and let's say closer to the end of our planting window, so the 30th of May, how likely is it we'll receive 200 mils of rainfall? And Climate says, well, it's fairly likely, we're almost 100% certain you'll get 200 mils, excluding a drought scenario. And pretty straightforward to do our other scenarios too. We just change those millimetres of rainfall. So if we bumped up to 300, we can see we slightly less, we're about 3/4 of the time. We go up to 450, we're less than 1/3 of the time we're likely to actually get the rainfall we require to break even on getting that cover crop. So I think that's sort of where I'd like to leave it. The rule of thumb that stood for many years is that we don't want to fall below 30%. Seems to be quite good. I haven't presented the yield results we've seen here because there's some unexplained things. So I'll say that we expected, you saw we stored 20 mil more of water, and that we extracted 40 mils more of water. And I'll just say that the yield responses we did see far outweighed the cost of putting a cover crop in. Part of that was likely due to establishment as well. We just haven't been able to break down exactly what generated or what contributed to give us the results that we did show. But what I will say is that they were very positive results to the cover crops at these two sites where we did manage to get the to pay off. So we've only got two sites in 1 year's worth of data, so I'm a bit reluctant to make too many profound statements about it. But just as a rough calculation, comparing your expected fallow efficiency versus what we know from our farming system sites versus the observed fallow efficiencies of between 35 to 70%, and I've chosen 50% for the numbers we run here. That could give you a rough idea of whether a cover crop would be worthwhile for you. And I think that sort of goes into our take-home messages, Rod. So,
okay, so the take-home messages out of all of that James and I just covered there is that out of all of it, ground cover of one form or another, whether it's a stubble from a preceding crop or the cover cropping example that James has just gone through, is really the prime thing that you need to be focusing on coming out of a dry period. You need to capture as much rainfall as you can, remembering the impacts of infiltration and stubble cover, what the surface is like, whether it's cracked or sealed, and also the impacts of evaporation. Avoiding the loss of moisture via weeds is also important, and make sure that you've properly assessed what that stored moisture is like prior to planting your first crop. And I guess from what James has just shown us there, that when your ground cover is getting fairly low, it is likely that you could be profitable to improve your ground cover via a cover crop approach. There's certainly some interesting work being done in that space. I just want to quickly take us through now that we've got to the point of saying we've got enough moisture, we're comfortable that we've assessed it well enough, there's enough there to guarantee us a go at a crop. What are the factors we've got to think about then about how do I maximise the yield of whatever it is that I plant next? And so this section we've called maximising crop yield. You'll hear me use that term, a harvestable yield, and you often get asked, well, what does that really mean? A harvestable yield is what is different from property to property almost, certainly district to district. And it's the amount of stored soil moisture that you have, plus what you think you might be likely to receive during the growing period, and whether that would be enough to produce a yield that you would consider worth harvesting. So we're not talking about, have I got enough to get a crop up and established like a cover crop? We're talking about, have I got enough moisture to get the crop established through to flowering, grain fill, without running out of water? Because as we've seen in the last couple of years, sometimes that can happen after we come out of a dry period. There's often a single rainfall event, and then we go into another dry period. So the first decision is, do you have enough moisture to produce a harvestable yield? The next question to ask is, well, which crop is going to give me the best chance of achieving that? And what decisions do I need to make to give the crop the best chance to reach its potential? So the first thing is, which crop should I be looking at to be the first thing we consider coming out of a dry period? It's easy to go for whatever's worth the most per tonne, but that does not always mean the greatest return per hectare. And that's mainly around the input costs required to grow the crop. And coming out of a dry period, it's really important, as I'm sure everybody knows, to balance the risk of a high return versus your needs for maintaining cash flow. And so what are the likely input costs for the crop you're considering? And typically some of our pulses, for example, can be more expensive to grow, but they also have a higher potential return. So that's sort of got to be weighed up. What's the reliability of producing a harvestable yield? And for example, sorghum in our environment we know is quite resilient. It will produce something under even quite poor conditions. And if you compare that to some of the shallower rooted crops like mung bean, for example, the reliability of a harvestable yield there is somewhat less. The third one is something a lot of people gloss over, is what experience do I have? And you sort of need to ask yourself that question if grain production is not a major part of your enterprise. And in fact, that then leads you to, well, what alternatives are possible? Is a fodder crop an option for me if I have grazing integrated into my business? And then linking back to the previous comment about experience, then maybe there's some options for leasing or share farming or something like that to simply get things underway again if you don't have that experience. But again, it all gets back to risk, and sometimes the coming out of a dry when your cash flow is poor is not the best time to be in a high risk scenario. Again, I reiterate the point from earlier that pulses and oilseeds, for example, are likely to end up producing less stubble cover than a cereal crop. So you can see from all of those points there that often planting a pulse into a low cover situation coming out of a dry can be quite risky. So you would want to have a lot of your ducks in a row before you went down that path. So before you plant, a lot of people do store their seed on farm. This chart is some work out of Cyro that gives you a bit of an indication of what happens to seed germination when it's been stored over a significant period of time. I draw your attention to the bottom axis, the x-axis there. You really need, if you're going to be storing grain for a long period of time, if you end up being out to almost storing it for a year, you can see that germination can drop away significantly if it's stored at high temperatures. And so that has implications for your grain storage equipment that you might have. You need to be checking the germination of seed whenever it comes out of storage for not only the total germination, but also vigor, the rate of germination, as well as the percent abnormals in the sample, which will give you an idea of how quickly that seed is likely to establish. This is really critical if you're in marginal moisture situations, because if the soil moisture is not ideal, then the last thing you want to do is plant seed that is going to be slow to germinate, because you will suffer quite significant losses. The planting window question is one that often gets asked as well. We always recommend to plant in the centre of regional planting windows. Plenty of people tell you they can plant wheat in August and still harvest a crop. That is true, but it will never maximise its use of soil moisture in terms of yield when it's planted well outside the window. And so sometimes the so-called best approach is actually to wait for the next window. So again, just keep in mind what's coming up, and being in too much of a hurry can actually have a negative impact financially at the end of the day. The other thing that people often overlook is the use of residual herbicides in the fallow. We know that prolonged dry weather can extend the activity of some products, some residuals. I'd encourage everyone, if you're in that space, to seek agronomic advice if you're unsure, because it does vary from product to product. The things you can look for yourself, though, are susceptible weeds to the product I've applied germinating successfully in that paddock. If they are, then you can probably just about bet that the herbicide has broken down. The other approach is what we call a bioassay, which would be a susceptible crop. You might have some seed in the shed or in the silo. You could actually go and plant some of that by hand in the corner of the paddock and see if it emerges successfully. The fertilizer strategy is also something to keep in mind here, that the soil testing should continue through that dry period to make sure you're on top of what requirements different crops will need. Remembering, though, that a prolonged dry will reduce the rate of nitrogen accumulation through the mineralisation process during that period. And also long fallow disorder impacts on phosphorus and zinc requirements. So if you've had a long weed-free fallow, then on a low phosphorus zinc soils, you could be up for more of that. But again, seek some agronomic advice if you're unsure. And again, with fertiliser, it's also about how much can I afford not to recoup from this crop. So particularly in terms of N applied, you can put it in the ground. It may not be lost, but available to subsequent crops. But if you've got payments to make on that fertiliser, then that doesn't really help you if it's another 18 months before you get the return on it. I just want to also remind people there about biosecurity issues. If you're buying in seed from somewhere else, there's usually a mad rush when planting windows do happen and the season does break. Just be careful of what you buy and what is in what you buy. And also, if we do have significant rainfall, you can end up with new weeds that you haven't seen before through floodwater as well. So early detection and removal is critical. You really need to get on top of those plants before they set seed. So once they've set seed, it's even harder to get on top of. So I'll just hand back to James quickly, and he'll go through some past drought experience.
Yeah, so look, just quickly before we finish up, thought it'd be worth providing some past experience with drought and drought recovery. So whilst there's been many studies done over the years looking at farm resilience and drought, one of the more recent ones was done in around the 2006-2007 drought at the tail end of the millennium in Western Australia. So no, it's a different system. So some of the stuff isn't going to be directly relevant, but I think a lot of the learnings are applicable pretty much where we are in cropping systems in Australia. So as an indication, you can see it's largely they're cropping-based systems. Average farm size is almost 5,000 hectares, or was back then, and they really more rely on annual rainfall falling during the cropping period over their winter crop. As an indication, so one of their ports here in the north, on average, in an average season, exports about 1.8 to 2.1 million tonnes of grain. In 2006 and 2007, they had a growing seasonal rainfall of less than 120 mil, and I think they exported less than 150,000 tonnes in 2006. So they had quite a severe drought. So one of the responses to this drought was looking at farm resilience. The West Australian government paid for some farm level data of 130 farms, looking at basically open access to all their books for a 6 or 7 year period, including that drought period, to see what the impact of the drought was and what sort of range in performance was. And having a look at the data, the farms could be grouped into one of 3 categories, and I'll just wait for the presentation to allow me to go forward. It doesn't like swapping between presenters, it seems. But one of 3 categories. So we had guys that were marginally impacted, ones that were impacted and recovered quite strongly, and ones that were actually on a decline prior to the drought and continued on a decline post the drought. But I'll just wait for the slide to come up. Hopefully, there we go. All right, so we can see that we could essentially group all the businesses in this into one of 3 categories, the majority of which were in group 1 and 2, which you can see is that black and red line on the graph there. So we had group 1, which were largely debt-free going into the drought. They were largely debt-free going out of the drought, had reasonable return on capital, had a small net penalty at the end. Group 2 had a bit more debt, but they used that productively, and they actually managed to get quite high returns on equity in 2008. And group 3, we can see it wasn't necessarily the trend they were on. They had that same trend from 2004 to 2005, and even 2008 to 2009. So it was actually difficult to draw out a drought effect in group 3 as to why it was, and that could be a whole number of different reasons. But I think that one of the real takeaways from this is I'm going to give you a bit of an indication as to the sort of information that was gone over. So there was 6 years of farm production data, and it covered the hectares owned, managed, permanent labour, wages, infrastructure, repairs and maintenance, depreciation, all their finance costs. Essentially anything you could think of in terms of costs and payments for a farm and their operating. And at the end of the day, essentially none of them were relevant aside from yield generated, and that was it. So even stuff like we would have expected to be relevant, stuff like farm size and the amount of rainfall they actually received, so minor differences between farms, didn't end up being relevant. Alongside this, the production data that was collected, there was also a social survey which looked at risk tolerance and use of consultants and a whole range of involvement in the community, how they dealt with stress and those sorts of things. And essentially what it came back with was that really none of the production data was relevant aside from the amount of yield that was generated, and that none of the only other thing that was important was management. Now, part of this is explained by the fact that I'm not sure if too many of you remember that 2008 we saw really great high grain prices. So how they performed in 2008 or after the drought had quite a big impact on overall performance. But what they actually did during the drought had very little impact on where they ended up. So I think that's probably quite an encouraging thing, in that it probably doesn't matter too much how you went during the drought. it's more about what you do now, or what you do before the drought, and what you do after the drought, or what you do now that makes the biggest impact. And it really came down to management, which is all those things that Rod went over earlier, looking at the timing and just getting those day-to-day decisions of getting your crop or just your business in general operating right. And with that in mind, we're going to bring together some existing resources that might be of use. And thankfully, GRDC has actually already done quite a good job of this. So you can see the link there at the top of the page as the resources and publications. It's called They're Dealing with the Dry. And they've actually got quite a large number of articles and resources that, ranging from the agronomy to farm business management decisions to, there's lots of links to mental and physical health support, and just other sort of decisions that you may need to make. So just recommend, if you're looking for some further resources, that's probably a really good spot to start. And I think that's pretty much all we had, isn't it, Rod?
Yeah, that's pretty much a good summary there, James. Just those take-home messages you see there is just the final words from us before we hand back to Greg. Dealing with the drought is as much about how you plan prior as how you respond following. So one of the things a lot of people lose focus on is planning early enough to then take advantage of when the season does change. And that's probably the one thing that successful people do well, is they have a plan with several options coming out of that dry period. I'll say it again, you'll get sick of hearing me say it, but ground cover, and mainly that is crop stubble, is king. Without ground cover and stubble, you can't start the process of recovering from the dry period. And when you do actually get a crop on the ground, it is critical that you make timely decisions to put you in the best position to produce yield and generate cash flow. So thanks, James. Thanks, Greg. I'll hand back to you.